Colorado will help Democrats take control of the Senate or preserve the Republican majority. Republican Senator Cory Gardner is embracing his allegiance to President Trump and Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, making the case that he's in a position to deliver for Colorado. If Coloradans deliver him back to the private sector for the first time in 15 years, that will complete a purge of Republicans out of high office in Colorado. Democrats turned to a man who wanted to be president, but Democratic primary voters did not share that desire. So former Governor John Hickenlooper is back, running for the Senate, a job he said he didn't want and wouldn't be good at. Two men Coloradans know well, with clear disagreements on health care, the economy, immigration, the Supreme Court, and how to handle the pandemic. Now all that's left is for them to debate and you to decide.
Brought to you by 9 News in association with Colorado Politics and the Fort Collins Coloradoan, and broadcast statewide by stations in every corner of Colorado. Presented live from the campus of Colorado State University in Fort Collins. Next presents Race for the Senate. Here are your moderators, Kyle Clark and Marshall Zellinger.
Good evening. Next expands to a commercial-free hour statewide this evening for this U.S. Senate debate. We are following public health guidelines as well as the guidance from our hosts here at Colorado State University. So we're holding this debate without an audience, with social distancing, and with health checks for everyone here.
And that includes our candidates for U.S. Senate, Republican Senator Cory Gardner, who for the remainder of this debate we'll refer to as Mr. Gardner, and his Democratic challenger, John Hickenlooper, who we'll also refer to as Mr. Hickenlooper. The topics and questions have been selected by the journalists of 9 News, ColoradoPolitics.com, and the Coloradoan, and have not been shared in advance with anyone.
The candidates will have 1 minute for answers, 30 seconds for rebuttals, with extended discussion at our discretion. You, as voters, deserve a debate filled with clear answers to clear questions, and for the candidates to have an opportunity to speak without interrupting one another. We'll also have at least one opportunity this evening for the candidates to pose direct questions to one another. So let's get started. Colorado's COVID-19 hospitalizations are at their highest point since the initial wave of the pandemic here back in the spring. Our test positivity rate just today hit 5%. That's a warning to public health experts. The same question to both of you to begin tonight. What is the single most important thing that we could do to improve our pandemic response, and what or who is standing in the way? Mr. Gardner.
Well, thank you, Kyle. Thank you to Channel 9 News, and thanks to Colorado State University. It's great to be back on campus as a Colorado State University graduate. Great to be here, and to all of the other sponsors of this event. A couple things we have to do. Number one, we must pass a relief package out of the United States Congress that follows up on the relief packages that we've already passed. This package would include support for people with unemployment benefits, additional dollars for vaccines, dollars for child care, dollars for education, the help for small businesses, allowing Paycheck Protection Program dollars to be back into the hands of businesses to keep their doors open, to make sure that we have a second draw on the loan. Those are the kind of things that we need to be pursuing. We also need to make sure that we're following social distancing, our guidances, and making sure that people are practicing good hygiene, including wearing a mask. But I will say this and start this evening off with what John Hickenlooper would have done in the United States Senate had he been there. He would have voted against the very bill that I described. Why? Because he said he would. A bill that would have provided unemployment relief, a bill that would have provided relief for education, for child care, new dollars for vaccine. We can't afford to have somebody who refuses to support the people of Colorado in the Senate.
Mr. Gardner, thank you. Mr. Hickenlooper, as he mentioned you can have a bit of extra time for rebuttal. If we want to have a longer discussion on this, we can. I'll restate the question for our viewers. What is the single most important thing we could do to improve our pandemic response, and who or what is standing in the way?
So we did see here as an introduction what I think we'll see a lot, that Cory Gardner is going to spend a fair amount of time on the attack. I think there'll be a fair amount of distortion and exaggeration. But I'll go to the question. The most important thing we can do is pass relief, make sure that relief gets passed out of the Congress. And again, Cory and I agree on this. Actually, 4 days ago, Cory was emphatic that he thought that COVID relief should take precedence and be a higher priority than making sure that we rush through this Supreme Court nomination, which is where the Senate focus seems to be. And I think the question has to be asked, if COVID relief is the most important thing, making sure that we get testing capacity and you know, the protective equipment, PPE for everyone, why, I mean, Corey could just say, I will not vote to support this thing, this projection, this Supreme Court nominee, if indeed the Relief Act doesn't get passed first. And there are 2 senators that said yesterday that they were not going to vote for it. His priority, and setting that priority clear, would be a strong point toward getting relief.
We're here in northern Colorado, where the JBS meatpacking plant saw one of the largest COVID-19 outbreaks in the state. Mr. Gardner, you bragged about getting 5,000 tests for JBS workers. Union leaders say that those tests never arrived. JBS also didn't test all its workers before reopening, as it has promised. Mr. Gardner, JBS is a significant donor to your campaign. Did that company properly protect its workers, and did you deliver the 5,000 tests promised?
Well, thank you, Marshall, for the question. I worked very closely with the state of Colorado and Governor Polis, and in fact, if you look at the record, you will see that Governor Polis said every employee at JBS who wants a test can get a test. That's not me saying it. That's not the news saying it. That's Governor Polis saying that there were tests for employees if they wanted them. We have to make sure that we're protecting employees. We have to make sure that we have personal protective equipment for our employees, whether they're working at a restaurant, whether they're working at a meatpacking plant. We also have to recognize the challenges that our food supply system went through when we had the initial stages of the pandemic hit. Our workers at JBS were heroes, and that's why I worked closely with the governor to make sure that we had those tests that they needed to make sure that we had them. And so we need to continue that effort to provide a secure food chain, to provide secure food supplies for our country. But when Governor Hickenlooper was in office, he had a chance to get the personal protective equipment that we needed for the state. And yet he refused to provide the personal protective equipment stockpile that could have protected us.
Before I allow a rebuttal from Mr. Hickenlooper, did the 5,000 tests arrive and the union is lying, or?
Well, you would have to again check with the governor. The governor said that they got all the tests that they needed for every employee if every employee wanted one.
Mr. Hickenlooper, you were name-checked in this. Did you fail Colorado by not having proper PPE years earlier?
No, that's ridiculous. Governor Polis has done a remarkable job, and I think we should recognize that his efforts have been superlative. I talked to a number of the workers at JBS, and they are emphatic that they did not get testing capacity, that they were asked and then forced to go back to work without having that knowledge of who's infected and who isn't. And I think that's a question of willful negligence, that we asked them to go back and protect our source of food without giving them the protections that any of us would expect.
May I respond?
You may.
Well, thank you. And again, what you heard from a former governor is that he takes no responsibility for failing to prepare Colorado for a pandemic. We actually have a state audit that shows while he was governor, they failed to prepare the state of Colorado for a pandemic. Communications problems still exist today, the same communications problems that he had when he was governor. And so I don't think you can pass the buck. We don't need somebody in Washington, D.C. who thinks it's about himself, refuses to take responsibility, and won't do the job for Colorado. He won't do it here. He certainly won't do it in Washington.
Mr. Gardner, thank you. Mr. Hickenlooper, a question for you as we continue our discussion about the best way to get COVID relief to the people who need it. Democrats in Congress have loaded up some of these COVID relief bills and economic stimulus bills with a bunch of goodies for political allies of theirs. Whether or not you agree with that approach, it's tough to say that that hasn't slowed things down. For the sake of speed alone, should Democrats in Congress quit doing that?
I think what we need to get into Washington is this ability to actually negotiate. What's been, to me, most frustrating is we haven't seen any willingness on the Republican or the Democratic side to sit down and actually roll up their sleeves and find where do we agree, where do we disagree, and begin looking at it. We've gone 6 months now since we've had any relief. And people that stopped getting their unemployment insurance in July, their rent protections have gone by, they don't have health care in many cases. This has gone on long enough, and yet one side or the other continue to say, oh no, it's their fault, and they're pointing fingers. This is the status quo. This is what I want to go to Washington and change, because we need negotiation. We need people to sit down and work out what the differences are. Again, Corey said 4 days ago in our debate that he would place a priority on this. If he stood up and said, I'm not going to vote for justice until we get relief, then we'd get relief, then we'd get negotiation. That's what we need to move forward.
The time has expired, but I didn't hear an answer to the question, so I'll ask again. I know you say both sides need to negotiate. I asked you about your side, the side that you might have some influence with. Do you think that Democrats should stop loading up these economic and COVID bills with goodies to get them through faster?
Yes, certainly if I was in Washington, I would do everything I can to make sure that there was an efficient process to get, a lean bill to put forward.
Okay, thank you very much. A few times tonight, you're going to hear us.
Can I respond to that if you don't mind?
I think we're going to move on and talk about the associated issue of healthcare now. If you really want to return to a topic, we can do that in Q&A.
Great, thank you.
A few times tonight, you're going to hear us reference disparity in Colorado, and that's a project that we have at 9 News that's studying the impact of racial disparities in our state, and one of them is healthcare. The percentage of Black and Latino Coloradans with health insurance almost doubled with the expansion of Medicaid coverage and the Affordable Care Act. Mr. Gardner, if you succeed in getting rid of the Affordable Care Act, the loss of health insurance would disproportionately fall on Black and Latino Coloradans at the same time that the pandemic is disproportionately affecting those communities. Has that situation given you any pause about trying to repeal the ACA?
Well, thank you, Kyle. I don't think this has to be a zero-sum game. I don't think it's either the Affordable Care Act or nothing. In fact, Governor Hickenlooper has said that he wants to replace the Affordable Care Act with a plan that he led several years ago with Governor John Kasich. We need to make sure that we are helping people, minority, African-American, Black populations, Hispanic populations in this state and across this country. Under my plan, we will focus on a patient-centered care system. We will allow people to increase their quality of care by decreasing the cost of care. We will do so through reinsurance programs and risk pools. We also have to recognize the work that we have done for minority communities across Colorado by growing our economy. If you're Black families in this state, in this country, have seen their wealth on average grow by 33%. Hispanic families have seen their wealth grow by 65% as a result of the economic policies. It's not a zero-sum game. Where I'm concerned, though, with is Governor Hickenlooper's plan to replace the Affordable Care Act, which would lead to a government-run program that would take 176 million Americans' insurance policies away from their workplace. That's his plan. That's irresponsible to destroy over 170 million Americans' insurance.
Thank you, Mr. Gardner. Mr. Hickenlooper, he described this plan that you're interested in with former Governor Kasich. This is something that's come up in a number of your discussions. So 30 seconds now for you to tell us, what is that plan? Are you still pursuing it? And what would it mean to Coloradans?
So I only get 30 seconds because you don't want me just to design or to talk to
This is your rebuttal, and he is describing your plan, and I'm giving you 30 seconds to tell folks what that plan actually is.
Okay. So John Kasich, the Republican governor of Ohio, who had also expanded Medicaid, we came together not to replace the Affordable Care Act. I never said that. He never said that. We were looking at ways that we could improve it, and especially focusing on ways that we could make the exchanges more cost-effective for people, because that's one of the problems. The Affordable Care Act, the Republicans have tried to take it away. They've never allowed us to report it, to repair it or improve it, not repair but improve it. And again, these attacks are threatening to dismantle it completely without us any kind of suitable replacement.
Thank you, Mr. Hickenlooper.
Mr. Gardner, the Affordable Care Act still exists. Some might call that pre-existing. Yet you've introduced an 8-line bill that you say will require insurance companies to cover pre-existing conditions. What part of that bill requires an insurance company to offer me coverage in the first place?
Yeah, the bill itself requires coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. That's what the bill does. It's maybe only 8 lines. I'll remind you that we're here today under a First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble, obviously, that was 45 words long. And I think the First Amendment got it pretty doggone right. This is a guiding principle that both Democrats and Republicans actually agree to, that we will provide coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. And we will make sure that the insurance companies, that's what my bill does, provide that coverage. Now, there may be some that disagree. Let's work on it together to make sure that it's right. That's the guiding principle, just as our First Amendment is the guiding principle for freedom of speech. Let's make sure that that protection for pre-existing conditions continues. What you heard Governor Hickenlooper say, though, is now he is saying he didn't want to replace the Affordable Care Act, but he is on record saying he wants to go to a government-run healthcare system. The danger of that is the destruction that it would have, the harm it would have on our rural hospitals. We're already in the bottom half of access for healthcare thanks to his failed leadership while he was governor.
Mr. Gardner, I didn't hear the answer to the part of the question of which part of the bill requires insurance companies to offer it to everyone. And I'll just add that the current Affordable Care Act includes a section entitled Guaranteed Availability of Coverage. If the Affordable Care Act were to be repealed, that guarantee goes away with it. Where does that exist in your 8 lines?
Marshall, the bill requires people to be covered if they have a pre-existing condition. That's what the bill does. It is a bill that provides that guidance, that principle that we will cover people with pre-existing conditions. That's the bill. Now, you may have a different interpretation. I look for every single one of the 11 bills that I've passed and signed into law. They've changed from the time they were in committee to the time they got signed into law. If people want to make this better, let's do it. But the guiding principle remains. I support and will demand and continue to demand coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. I will not, like Governor Hickenlooper, take away the insurance from 176 million Americans.
I just want to put a button on this. If the ACA were to go away and this bill exists, does everyone get coverage who wants it?
That's my bill. Okay. My bill requires people, pre-existing conditions you're saying?
If
yes,
you're requiring
so my bill requires people to get coverage with pre-existing conditions. If that's the question, that's the answer.
Thank you, Mr. Gardner.
Mr. Hickenlooper, you were the first person held in contempt by Colorado's Independent Ethics Commission, which found that you broke the law in accepting illegal gifts. You've blamed Republicans. You've misleadingly claimed that you were exonerated on dozens of allegations. And you told Marshall that journalists should be protecting you on this. Do you regret breaking the law? And perhaps more importantly, will you change your behavior if voters return you to elected office?
Well, I recognize that there were 2 reporting errors, and the Ethics Commission found us in violation for those 2 occasions. The Denver Post referred to it as relatively minor and honest mistake. I can guarantee you they were inadvertent. We had a team of people that worked on this, but they obviously weren't perfect. I think we should recognize that these allegations came from a dark money Republican organization that was created 2 days before all these allegations were filed, and their sole purpose was to try and create material for attack ads. As I think everyone in Colorado has seen this summer, those attack ads were relentless. And that's bringing Washington politics to Colorado. Again, I paid the $2,800 fine. I take responsibility for that. I certainly will make sure that that never happens again. When I went, I testified for 3 hours in front of the commission and told the truth to every question they asked.
Thank you, Mr. Hickenlooper.
Mr. Hickenlooper, another question about honesty and ethics comes from Ernest Lunning. It's a recorded question, and he's with our partners at coloradopolitics.com.
Governor, you've been endorsed by all the leading gun safety organizations who point to legislation you signed in 2013. But after signing those bills, you told Colorado sheriffs that you hadn't expected the magazine ban to be so controversial and that you only signed it because a staff member had committed you. Saying one thing publicly and then privately saying the opposite, that's something you accuse Senator Gardner of doing. How are you any different?
Let me be very clear. I stand by my record on gun safety. We're the first purple state to actually roll up our sleeves and pass universal background checks. To this day, Cory Gardner, Mitch McConnell don't think that universal background checks really work. They're not sure it's worth the $10. They can't, no one can get it onto the floor as long as Mitch McConnell is the majority leader of the Senate, because they just don't think it's effective enough. The bottom line is, and step back and look at this, Cory Gardner's received almost $4 million in support from the NRA and gun manufacturers. Mitch McConnell's received even more. I mean, this is big money at play in politics, I think. And Cory Gardner's received more corporate PAC money, $5.7 million, than any elected official in Colorado history. And suddenly the corporations get these massive tax breaks.
Thank you, Mr. Hickenlooper.
If I could respond.
Let's jump in, but if we could target the question to what Coloradans know, okay? Coloradans know what our gun rights or gun control landscape looks like. So perhaps you could explain, Mr. Gardner, what gun control laws we have in Colorado that you don't think apply or should be passed nationwide? He talked about universal background checks, but we've got a lot of other things. Could you compare what we have here to what you'd like to see nationwide?
Well, look, I also want to reply to the governor's attacks, because he has attacked quite frequently in this debate, and we haven't always had a chance. I haven't always had a chance to respond. Look, I support our Second Amendment, and I believe we have laws in place that need to be enforced. But I don't think that when it comes to prohibiting a sale between a father and a son, interfering at that level, that that's a good thing for our country. Now, Colorado may be handling this in a different way, but I don't think that we should infringe on those rights that our family sales. If I want to give my son the 12 gauge that I grew up learning to hunt with, I ought to be able to do that. If you look at some of the bans that the governor put in place, the experts said they had very limited effect, and he lied to the county sheriffs about that. He lied to the county sheriffs about that effort. He wants a national gun license. He wants everybody in this state to have a national federal license for that firearm, infringing on our Second Amendment rights. What he's saying here is different than what he actually wants to do in Washington. It's this two John Hickenloopers. One seems to say something here, one wants to do something there. It is not right for our state.
Mr. Hickenlooper, for 30 seconds, I want to give Ernest a fair chance at an answer to this question. He asked an introspective question about yourself, saying one thing publicly, saying something else privately, and you spent your entire time telling me about Cory Gardner. The question was about you.
Right. So, again, I stand by my record on gun safety. My original intention was that we should have the magazine limits would pass a year later. For a variety of reasons, that moved forward rapidly. The bottom line is that before the COVID, we were having one mass shooting a day. And it's long overdue that we begin looking at how do we keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people. And universal background checks is an obvious way of doing that, making sure that we don't have high capacity magazines available to whenever and whoever wants them is an equal challenge.
I have to say a 9 News investigation has found that they're still widely available high-capacity magazines. So that talking point we have proven hasn't changed what exists in Colorado.
If I can be, I'm not trying to be argumentative, oftentimes when laws are passed, it takes a while. It takes years sometimes before they become the norm. They become part of culture. But if you don't pass the laws, if you don't set requirements that everyone who's going to buy a gun should give their driver's license, we should be able to find out whether they, we found when we looked at the background checks for 2012, there were 138 people who'd been convicted of homicide in Colorado. They tried to buy a gun and we stopped them.
We're going to have time for back and forth.
Because I think it's important. Look, Governor.
Mr. Gardner, we're going to have time to talk back and forth in a moment.
Okay.
We're going to shift now to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who died 46 days before Election Day. 4 years ago, Justice Antonin Scalia died 269 days before the election. And 4 years ago, you said, quote, "Our next election is too soon and the stakes are too high. The American people deserve a role in this process." Now you're okay with a vote on the nominee. My question is not about the Supreme Court. Why should anyone trust that you'll stand by anything you're telling us tonight?
Well, thank you, because in 2016, when this occurred, I was expressing the Senate's ability to follow its requirement of advise and consent under the Constitution and to follow the precedent at the time, which was laid out by then Vice President Joe Biden during his time in the U.S. Senate. Today, we're following the precedent laid out since the late 1800s and continuing to adhere to the advise and consent of the United States Constitution. The Constitution very clearly allows a president to nominate, to the Senate to provide that advice and consent. We did not provide that consent in 2016 based on the precedent. As we have the nominations and the hearings today, we'll move forward. To be clear, though, the American people, the people of Colorado, certainly deserve a chance to get an answer from Joe Biden and John Hickenlooper on what they want to do to the United States Supreme Court, and it involves court packing. I asked John last week if he supported court packing. I don't know if you want to answer that tonight, John, but I would just say this. Joe Biden doesn't think the people of Colorado or this country deserve an answer on court packing. I hope that you agree Coloradans deserve an answer on whether or not you support packing the courts with additional judges.
All right, Mr. Gardner, thank you very much. Mr. Hickenlooper, I do want to talk about this issue because it's something that's been in the news. Both you and Joe Biden have avoided answering whether you would support expanding the size of the Supreme Court or other measures that could be seen as either retaliation or reform based on what Republicans have done with the Supreme Court. So let's try this in a different format. Let's try these as yes, no, or I don't want to say. Do you support expanding or packing the Supreme Court if Republicans confirm Amy Coney Barrett? Yes, no, or I don't want to say.
It's a hypothetical. I would support it. Let's put it this way. I don't like the idea of court packing. We're seeing it right now, right? We're seeing court packing in full fury, and it doesn't make any sense to me. I think if you get new people to Washington, you won't have to do that kind of institutional change. And that's
All
what
right,
I've been
we're going to
saying.
go on to the next yes, no, or I don't want to say question. Do you support term limits for Supreme Court justices?
Again, there are so many variables. No, I mean, I don't support term limits at this point, but who could say in the future, right?
Another idea has been rotating lower court judges onto the Supreme Court for fresh blood. Yes, no, or I don't want to say.
I've never heard that, so I haven't
Okay.
thought about it.
That's fair enough. Do you support expanding the size of lower courts to reshape the judiciary?
Again, I haven't seen the pros and cons. I have not
Fair enough.
delved into that.
Another thing that's been talked about, the Democrats could do in retaliation for what the Republicans are doing with the Supreme Court, is creating statehood for the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. Yes, no, don't want to weigh in?
You know, I think those are different issues that have been discussed long before we got into this court
But it's being
packing.
discussed in the context of a retaliatory action because of the
Well,
court.
just for the record, long before we saw this kind of court packing, I have said that I think Washington, D.C. should be a state. So I'm on the record of that, but it has nothing to do with court packing.
Understood. And Puerto Rico?
Puerto Rico, I don't think I'm on the record, but I could be persuaded. I mean, again, this is it's no different or it's similar in many ways to Hawaii when we brought Hawaii into as part of the United States.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Gardner, on the court, President Trump's Supreme Court nominee, Amy Coney Barrett, she's personally opposed to abortion, and she said today that Roe versus Wade is not a super precedent. It's not safe from being reversed. Last week, there were a couple of conservative justices on the court that suggested that gay marriage should also be overturned. Are you comfortable with overturning a woman's right to an abortion and gay Americans' right to marry?
Both cases are settled law. I think we've heard that discussion quite at depth today, actually, about settled law and the precedent, and that precedent should be respected. But I also want to make sure that we understand here what court packing means. It is a Orwellian spin in newspeak to say that court packing is what is taking place today. Court packing for 100 years, 150 plus years in this country's history has been identified as adding judges to the lower courts or to the U.S. Supreme Court until you get enough judges on the court to rule your way. Now, John knows exactly what court packing means. He's trying to hide tonight behind the lawful filling of nominations and approval by the United States Senate. So the question is to Governor Hickenlooper, do you support adding justices to the Supreme Court more than 9, 10, or 11? That's the question he should answer, because that's the definition of court packing. Ruth Bader Ginsburg opposed it.
So just as a quick follow-up then, on the principle that you just outlined, one consequence of court packing or expanding the court is that Democrats do it, then Republicans do it again, then Democrats do it again. You just get this larger and larger and larger court, which could water down the judiciary. I assume, based on what you're saying, that if you were reelected and continue to serve in the Senate, that if Democrats expand the court or pack the court, that you would adamantly oppose Republicans doing it in return.
Absolutely.
Years later.
Look, the nine has worked for over 150 years.
Thank you very much.
We don't need more. It's worked for 150 years. It's too bad that Governor Hickenlooper can't admit that.
Well,
thank
Mr. Gardner, this is the part you've been waiting for. You've left a question dangling out there. This is the opportunity to ask each other a question. Okay. It's a 60-second answer. It's a question from you. I just heard one. I don't know, maybe it's the same one you're about to ask, but Mr. Gardner, I'll let you ask the first question.
Well, thank you for the question. Over the last several months, we have seen a great division in our country. We've seen racial injustice. We've seen racial inequality. We've seen the murder of George Floyd on television. We've seen defund police movements across the country. We've seen violence this weekend with the death of a protester. Governor Hickenlooper, you supported a fund called Chinook that included funding for Recreate 68, a radical organization that demanded violence at the 2008 convention in Denver. that supports defunding the police, that supports violence against police. Do you stand by your support today for Recreate 68?
I don't know anything about Recreate 68. Chinook was a foundation where community activists trying to improve their own community had the responsibility and the opportunity to give grants out to all kinds of people, all kinds of organizations. I was not involved, haven't been involved in a grant from the Chinook Fund in 30 years. So again, the whole point of Chinook is they're trying to allow people that opportunity to make decisions that improve their own community.
Mr. Hickenlooper, you can ask a question of Mr. Gardner now.
So, Senator Gardner, you have talked about the meeting you convened in January, really one of the first meetings to recognize the seriousness of COVID-19. And I think there are a couple senators who actually sold stock there. But then 3 weeks later, you came back to Colorado Springs. There was a large rally with President Trump. Many thousands of people, most of them without masks and shoulder to shoulder, were there. And as you stood side by side with Donald Trump, you didn't warn anyone, any of the Coloradans, about the risk that they were facing by being in that rally. Why was that?
Yeah, thank you, Governor Hickenlooper. Look, I held the very first briefing in the United States Senate, demanded the very first briefing in the United States Senate to make sure that we heard from Admiral Girard, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Redfield to discuss what was happening with this novel coronavirus. I had hoped that everybody in the Senate would attend this briefing. Unfortunately, there were only about 12 people because at the very beginning of the virus, January, February, people were encouraging, like Nancy Pelosi, to go to Chinatown, to Mayor de Blasio, encouraging people to go out and eat. There were mistakes at every level of government in the very beginning days, including the experts who said, we don't know if masks are effective or not. We have to improve our response every single minute of the day. That's our local levels, our state and federal levels, and that's what I continue to focus on. I wish more people would have attended that very first hearing.
A clarifying question, Mr. Gardner, because this is something that we wanted to bring up as well. At the time of that February rally, when you were shoulder to shoulder with President Trump, we now know, thanks to the journalist Bob Woodward, what the president actually thought of COVID-19 at that point, that it was tremendously serious, way worse than the flu, airborne, and so forth. Did President Trump tell you before you stood next to him in that crowd that he knew all those things? Did you have that knowledge?
No, I did not, but we knew this was something that we had to deal with. We knew that we had something from China that we didn't understand. China was lying to us at the time. China was lying to the world, saying it couldn't be transmitted the way that we now know that it can. The WHO was covering up for China. And so, look, we have to make sure that we don't follow the same mistakes that Nancy Pelosi made inviting people to Chinatown, or Mayor de Blasio inviting people to go out to dinner. But I also think it's important that we stand up to places like China. Governor Hickenlooper just last week said that China is not a problem. China isn't a bad country.
That's
yet they
time
gave
there.
us
To
the
clarify, I
coronavirus.
wasn't asking you about China or Nancy Pelosi or anybody else. I was asking you whether you wish the president had leaned over and told you what he knew, which was, this is really bad, way worse than I'm saying, and here we are with a crowd of however many tens of thousands of people.
Look, I don't know what he knew or didn't know. I certainly wish that we would have had all of the information at the very beginning of this. The World Health Organization, China, what they were lying about. Look, I think if you look at what Nancy Pelosi, I bring that up because Nancy Pelosi was saying at the beginning of this, let's go out to Chinatown, Mayor de Blasio, let's
I think
go
we've
out to
covered
dinner.
this
So
ground.
I'm just saying that there was a lot of mistakes early on throughout this entire,
Okay.
on all sides of this.
Okay, thank you.
We got the question to each other out of the system. That's good. Let's return to Disparity in Colorado, our project to discuss racial equality and specifically police reform. Mr. Hickenlooper, during your term as Denver mayor from 2003 to 2011, Denver City Council approved more than $6 million to settle use of force cases or deaths involving law enforcement, settlements and incidents that have continued since. How will you be able to reform these problems as a senator when you weren't as mayor and even governor?
So I look at the progress we made when Paul Childs was shot. Before I was even inaugurated as a mayor, we began police reform. We worked with the Black Ministerial Alliance, and we created some of the first major reforms: Civilian Oversight Commission, an Office of the Independent Monitor to investigate claims of misconduct by the police. And we began trying to hold police officers accountable. I think what's remarkable is that Colorado, our General Assembly this past year, actually on a bipartisan level, passed legislation that is a model for what we should be able to do nationally. They banned chokeholds, they banned no-knock warrants. They required police officers to keep their cameras on. They held police officers accountable for their actions. They passed limitations on qualitative immunity. This is the type of reforms that need to go to Washington, instead of what we've seen so far in Washington has just been suggestions without any real teeth.
Thank you, Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Gardner, how do you believe systemic racism affects Coloradans, and what have you done about it?
Well, look, I believe that this country is inherently good. I believe that this nation is a great nation that has made mistakes, yes. That we learn from those mistakes, yes. Our souls were seared in a way perhaps that we've never seen with the murder, watching it, of George Floyd. And we must make sure that we are passing reforms like the Justice Act that John Hickenlooper has belittled here tonight. Legislation that would have provided tracking for police violence and opportunities for us to get more dollars in the hands of states to do the right thing when it comes to police reforms. We need to make sure that we pass the Justice Act. We need to make sure that we focus on things like the First Step Act, which is our bill to reform sentencing, our efforts to provide historically black colleges and universities with mandatory funding so that we can bring more equality. But again, what you didn't hear from John Hickenlooper tonight is why he didn't step away and why he didn't condemn Recreate 68, which called for violence, which called for defunding police, why he won't call for an investigation into what he now describes as a murder of Marvin Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Gardner. Let's talk about climate change and the energy industry. And the questions come from J.C.